the Wild Deer was a beautiful ship of 1,015 tons. She was built by Connell and Company in Glasgow in 1863, a China clipper, and the New Zealand government had chartered her for bringing immigrants to New Zealand. She could carry 200 passengers and had approximately 47 crew. At that period in time, 1883, she was owned by Messrs. Patrick Henderson and Company, and she had done 10 voyages to New Zealand in 77 to 100 days. But on this her last journey, on the 12th of January 1883, she ran aground off Clochey at 11 p.m. So this story is covering the rescue of the passengers and the crew. No one was lost, all souls were saved. But I'm going to interview a few locals to see what they have to say. Now it's a cold old morning, squally showers, freezing. But I'm heading over to Portavogie to speak with a man called James Cully. And James has dived around the wreck of the Wild Deer, has seen her, has been down where she was wrecked, and I'm going to have a little word with him and seeing if he can enlighten me any more on the story.
Well, she was built, she was composite built, which means composite. She had iron frames, iron ribs, and then they would have been covered with probably oak planking, and that's why today all the oak, all the timber, most of it's rotted off her, but the frames of the Wild Deer are still there, though they're well tangled up, bent, but they still exist.
And you're telling me that among that framework there is a lot of cups, saucers, cutlery, crockery, whiskey bottles, whatever?
Yep. But now again, all broken up. There's a bay on the North Rock, on the south side of the North Rock, named Wild Deer Bay, and the whole bay would be covered, the whole seabed in there's covered with broken cups, whiskey bottles, crockery, a load of stuff in there, but nothing, there's nothing unbroken.
And what have you been able to get some bits off the Wild Deer?
Well, now the only pieces that we got we've got two of these. These are what are called dead eyes. These were part of the rigging on the Wild Deer. I think there's only two of these left. These were used to tighten the stays going to the mast, and as you can see the holes, which are pretty well worn in that this was made of what they call green heart, the heart of an oak tree, and that's why it's so hard that it still survives to this day.
And that is for tightening the rigging on the ship, the ropes running through? Yeah,
there have been ropes running up through that. This one here actually had some type of a steel rope round it here, although it's rotted, but when I got it, it has some strands left on it. You see the rust on it there. But again, that even to drill a hole in that today, it's as hard as flint. It's really, really good quality stuff. But that's all that survives.
Yeah.
Grandfather and his father, at the time of the sinking of the ship in 1883, my grandfather, who was Adam Palmer, he would have been a young boy of 9 years old, and at that time he lived with his parents. His father was Johnny Palmer, and they lived down in a house called Beachmount at Stable Hole, which isn't there anymore. But anyway, he and his father went out, presumably after the ship went on the rocks, sometime after. I don't know whether they were trying to help or what happened, but they came back with some articles. The only one I know about is that amber sugar bowl, or bowl of some kind. And it's been in the family for something like 140 years now. and it used to reside in my mother's china cabinet, as women of that time, well, they all had a china cabinet, and it was always referred to as the Wild Deer Sugar Bowl. Wild Deer Sugar Bowl, it's pronounced locally. So it's in the house to this day.
Just up from Portavogie Harbour a little, there's a little cottage, and the roof timbers in it are made from the timber out of the Wild Deer Shipwreck. And this is the little cottage here, 1883, Shipwrecked. So the roof was put on this in 1883, which was probably when it was being built. There's a great buttress against the gable wall of this house. All these houses were just built on the sand. They're only a stone's throw from the shore. No foundation. So it's a cold, blustery day, and I'm standing outside the little Presbyterian church in Clochie, where the survivors of the wild deer were brought into in dribs and drabs from out at sea. And it was blowing a half gale, something like this morning. And I'm just going to take you in through the church now. Now here I am, sitting in the old Presbyterian church in Clochie, and I'm pondering what it would have been like for the passengers of the Wild Deer, which crashed onto the rock just out there at 11 in the evening. And it was 7 o'clock the next morning before the lifeboat could make to them. The lifeboat was launched right away. The ship had set rockets up in her distress, and the lightship the other side of her had answered, and the lifeguard station here in Clochie also had answered, and almost right away. But they loosed the boat, set sail the lifeboat, and she foundered and filled with water and smashed a couple of boards in her. So of course they had to wait then till the tide went out past to get that emptied out. So it was from 11 o'clock at night to 7 the next morning. They were anxiously teetering back and forward. The ship was rocking from side to side. 17-foot draft in that ship. She needed water below her. And she was over on her side, the main mast. She was toggling. It says they sounded the depth of the water. There was plenty of water behind the ship, the stern, and there was plenty of water at the front, but in the middle it was less. And she had 900 tons of cargo on her. So, and there was ore on her as well, and it was very heavy, and whatever way she was, it kind of broke the ship's back as she was toggling. And the main middle mast, it fell and came down and wrecked the lifeboat, so they had one boat less. So the pandemonium on the ship must have been serious. One of the accounts says that the lady folk were in, obviously everybody was in bed, or a lot of them, and the ones that weren't had ran down from the deck and said, we're wrecked, caused pandemonium, and it ended up they had to lock the ladies below because there was so much pandemonium. So can you imagine the boat breaking up and the water coming in and you're locked down below? So to come into this old church for a refuge must have been absolutely amazing, and to get dried out in the room there may have been a fireplace somewhere in the wall here, but it's obviously 1880s we're talking about, and this is 2021.
Well, it was only recently that I found out that my great-grandmother and my grandmother, who was only a girl at the time, and her two sisters helped to provide food for the people who were rescued off the ship. They lived in Portavogie because at that particular time, Clochie Church also served Portavogie. That's why it was actually called Clochie and Portavogie Presbyterian Church. So the people from Portavogie were actually members of the Presbyterian Church in Clochie. I was working in the garden one hot summer day, and suddenly someone came round the corner of the house and said, "Good day." And it happened to be a man called Michael Cole from near Auckland, about 30 miles from Auckland in North Island, New Zealand. And he was on a mission to find out where the wild deer had been wrecked, because as a child he remembered his grandmother telling the story very often of how she was shipwrecked. And it was his ambition for quite a while to see where his granny had been shipwrecked. And as soon as he retired, he set out from New Zealand to come here and actually see the spot where she had come to grief.
So 250 people to cater for. The folk were lying down on the pews here, and this pew that I'm sitting in, you'd be lucky if you got 2 people lying end to end on it, so it wouldn't have held too many. Of course, there's the floor area around the hall as well, which would have been used. But they reckon the old windmill, stump up windmill lane opposite it, that it was used for putting people in. Local farmers swept their barns out. The straw bedding for the cattle was put in it, and the people slept on that. Because if she wrecked at 11, they were back in at 7 in the morning. They started coming in here, dribs and drabs, little fishing yawls, bringing them in, their own lifeboats, the lifeguard. That was all coming in dribs and drabs. So it was actually the next day before people were able to get enough horses and traps, needed mustered, farm carts, anything to transport 250 people back up to Newtownards, which is, Newtownards is about 12, 13 miles away, 14 miles maybe. And there was a train station there to get the folk on the train back up to Belfast to get a steamship back home to Glasgow from the departure point. So to get all those horses and carts around the locality mustered up and get transportation for everybody, and there'd have been the odd Sharabang bus type thing as well. So you can imagine the pandemonium that caused in this little community with only like fishermen's houses in it. And as I'm sitting here, I'm sensing that feeling of relief and anger and everything else. Some of the folk didn't want to go home to Glasgow until they could see if their chests, which they had all their property in, could be salvaged. So that was another angle as well. So that's one or two of the points that we've been looking at here, but it's an amazing part of our history in Cloughie. There was another little bit to the story which kind of casts a bit of a shadow on it. Apparently the fishermen, when they got out to the wreck, they demanded exorbitant sums to transport the people in, £1 a head. And the folk bantered and haggled with them because they were only too glad to get off the boat, down to 6 shillings and sixpence. Is what one of the reports says. So, but you can imagine too that to take your boat out when there was a half gale blowing over a treacherous rocky area, there was big risk involved in that as well. So that's your little trip around the church here at Cloughie, where most of the people were brought in, and I suppose a roll call and everything made. No one was lost, everyone was saved. So it's a great story at that angle. On board the Wild Deer was a passenger called Willie Watson. And Willie Watson had managed to get up to Newtownards, across to Belfast, onto another steamship or whatever to get back to Glasgow direction, or Dalsurf, where he was from. And of course it takes news a little bit of time to travel in that period of time in the 1800s. So Willie was back home and was walking up the avenue to his home farm, and there was folk looking out the window, and they exclaimed, "If I didn't know Willie Watson was away to New Zealand, I would swear that was him." And it was Willie Watson. He was back home before the news had got back on the wreck of the Wild Deer. So there you are, folks. That has brought us to the end of part 46 of Sheep in a Shoestring, the rescue of the passengers and crew of the Wild Deer. So next week, keep your eye open, because that man, Willie Watson, We're going to do a little bit on Willie's story. How did he do? What happened in life to Willie Watson? That's his story next week, and that will conclude the Wild Deer Shipwreck story. So see you next week. Hey, who's poking in my pockets here?